Welcome back to the Hardware Unbox podcast for episode 58. 2 episodes in 1 week. How exciting is that? But we're back to talk about the GeForce RTX 5080, the very disappointing launch of this product and all the implications that we're seeing based on that for the rest of the GeForce series, what we think Nvidia is doing, potentially, where this leads in the future, this sort of strategy of not providing much of a gain, where does that go? And then obviously even more discussion about the opportunity that this opens for other brands and other things, including some maybe not so bold predictions about where we see Radeon and things like that. So anyway, let's get into it. Well, Steve, boy, am I excited to be sitting here talking to you about another wonderful graphics card release, the GeForce RTX 5080. Let's get excited. New products. Isn't it so good, this new GPU?
Yay. Yeah, I mean, I can't even fake the enthusiasm for this one. I'm sorry, Tim.
I'm trying to hype it up. I'm trying to do my best here, but boy, it's not very good, is it?
It is properly depressing. Really, there's no other way to put it. Yeah. I mean, not a great way to start the podcast, but I guess I'm going to go move over to the couch and we'll explore this, Tim.
We need to do a bit of therapy on the GeForce RTX 5080, that's for sure.
Well, I mean, this really does emphasize what we've said time and time again. When the 9700X, the Ryzen 7, Zen 5 part, when that arrived and we were bummed by how bad that was and we were kind of dunking on it, at least some people thought we were, and we were doing that for views or whatever. And we're like, no, this is actually bad. It's depressing. Like, we want to make content about hardware we think you should buy. We're not influencers. We don't hype up, technologies like multi-frame generation to get you excited about these GeForce 50 series. Like, there's ways you could go about hyping this stuff. Clearly, you see the marketing departments doing exactly that. But that's not our role. We're here to recommend actual good products that are going to provide you with actual performance improvements. And for a lot of people, you've got to be, well, I was going to say you have to be coming from a fair way back. Like, let's even say, as some people might think this is a bit silly because it's not that far back, but RTX 3080. From the RTX 3080 to the 5080, kind of a nice performance gain. But as I said in the video, it feels disingenuous even trying to pitch that sale, because you could have essentially got that, and potentially it would have been better value to do so 6 to 12 months ago with a 4080 Super, because you would have had 6 to 12 months of additional experience with that product. So it's not even good in that sense. Like, it's difficult. You can really just say, well, it is arguably a class-leading product at its price point, and it's gotten a little bit better. So that's good. Even that, though, clutching at straws. I mean, I've seen here the local pricing, which maybe you want to talk about a bit later on. I'm not sure, but
go for it.
It's bad. It's bad. Actually, I think we can talk about that sort of stuff anyway by the time this goes live.
Well, this will be live by the time 5080s are available. So
yeah. So I was getting pricing information on particular models. I think the cheapest model in Australia is expected to be about 2,200 Australian dollars. And if I recall correctly, prior to this release, you could get a 4080 Super for about 1,800 Australian dollars. I did have some notes of that, though I haven't got it here in front of me. But you can probably look it up. I don't know if you've made any notes on that. But essentially, we're getting a small, very, very small performance uplift for a very huge price premium, at least here in Australia. Are they going to hit $1,000 US? It seems like if they do, very few models will. Most are probably going to sell above that. So this is something we're going to have to revisit in a month from now.
Yeah. I mean, the basic reality is the 5080 is bad at $1,000. So at any price above that, it gets worse and worse and worse. And if you're paying $1,200 for this card, that's a joke. Like, if the majority of cards are in that $1,200 to $1,400 range, that's just a massive fail on the part of Nvidia. I don't know who to blame. Nvidia, the board makers, not sure. This card should not be a cent over $1,000. In fact, it should be like a few $100s below $1,000, let alone like $1,100, $1,200. It's just, not good.
Yeah, I just found my notes. The 4080 Super was selling for as little as, I say as little as, but this is true, as little as 1,700 Australian dollars. Regardless of whether that's too much or whatever for a GPU, we were paying $1,700 for a 4080 Super, and now the entry-level price will be $2,200 for a 5080. So that's just the reality here.
Yep. Not good.
It's crazy. So definitely getting scalped there. At least we are here in Australia. Again, I haven't got any insight on the US pricing at the time of recording this. We'll have some idea by the time this podcast goes live, I imagine. And as I said, we'll have a better picture of it in about a month from now. But yeah, as for who to blame and all that, I mean, ultimately, the blame, just like we saw with Zen 5, comes down to Nvidia. Yeah, you can say due to other limitations, they couldn't do much more than they did. The architectural improvements they made weren't going to yield strong performance gains for games at this point in time, kind of like a Zen 5 situation. So, I'm not sitting here bashing Nvidia for not doing better. Like, we've seen big performance gains becoming harder and harder to achieve. So if that's just the reality of the situation, then fine. I'm not committing to this or saying this is the situation. I'm just saying, if that were the situation, fine. Okay, I can accept that. I mean, if that was the reality, then that's the reality. I'm not saying it is. I'm just sort of take this situation that I'm creating here as a hypothetical, okay? Let's just say that the architectural improvements they were working on, weren't going to yield big gains for performance for games. We got what we got, okay? That's fine. We got what we got. But the problem I have is there's no limitations on the VRAM configurations for, a 12 gigabyte card doesn't have to be a 12 gigabyte card. And even then you can say, well, you could clamshell it and double the capacity that way, or it doesn't have to be 12 gig. It doesn't have to have a certain memory bus. Like, I know it does now that it's been created, but prior to shaping the generation, they're quite flexible in how they configure their entire lineup. Obviously, it's set in concrete now. But
I think you're bringing up pretty much the main point that I was going to make in this podcast, which is Nvidia, I don't know whether they shot themselves in the foot, because let's be honest, these cards are still going to sell and market share, blah, 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 right? Don't come into the comments and say all that stuff, right?
Yeah.
They shot themselves in the foot by the configurations. These GPU configurations they made were never going to work. Never going to work.
Well,
because
I get what you're saying. If they do sell really well, then ultimately it doesn't matter, and we're just whinging about nothing, and Nvidia played the market and they analyzed it correctly, and they got to give gamers the minimum amount of whatever it was that they could give them, and they accepted that, and they got their sales. I don't think that'll be the situation, but I'm just saying, if that was the situation, then we're just moaning about it. We're moaning on behalf of the gamers that the product was disappointing and sucked, but Nvidia still wins in that scenario.
Yes. I'm talking more about if Nvidia wanted to make a good series, and maybe by the time they'd made these configurations, they were genuinely hamstrung by what they had decided years ago when they decided to make these GPU dies. Because let's be honest, the 5080 having being basically half the size of a 5090 was just not going to work compared to the configuration they made with the 4080, unless they could have clocked this GPU significantly higher, which just really wasn't the case. So the fact they went from a 750 square millimeter die with 21,760 CUDA cores, and the next step down for them is a 378 square millimeter die with 10,752 CUDA cores. Again, some of it's binned, so the actual GPU's potentially a little larger than that, but you get what I mean, right? Like, this 5080 configuration should have been a larger GPU die. It's just that simple.
Yeah.
It didn't have to be a cut down GB202 or whatever, but there needed to be something between GB203 and GB202 that was maybe in the 500 square millimeter size, that had more CUDA cores, a larger memory bandwidth, a larger memory bus, that sort of thing. And that would have been a reasonable product. Could they have made it, $1,000? Don't know. There's a whole price discussion there. But the fact that this configuration, they're basically quite close to maxing out this configuration. And what is it, like 10% faster at best? That's a configuration issue. Like that is pure and simple. They made the wrong configuration for that card. And it applies to most of the other cards in the lineup too. The 5070 does not have more CUDA cores than a 4070 Super. And of course, there's the VRAM issues there. So I don't buy this BS of they're limited in all these different ways with these things. They made the wrong choices with the configurations. And had they made better choices with how they configured each of these GPU dies, the products had the potential to be a lot better.
So I was going to say, that's exactly where I was heading with what I was saying. I was saying, in a reality where the IPC, the timing wasn't right. The architectural changes they made didn't yield those results, and the node process and all that sort of stuff. So they ended up with what they ended up with. It's like, okay, I can accept that. But then, there's the configurations, which you just said they've got completely wrong. And that includes VRAM capacity, doesn't it? So basically they stuffed up the configuration and then the pricing for those configurations. So just they didn't salvage it.
Yeah, and I think Nvidia would respond to that by saying, well, it costs a lot of money to make a larger GPU die now. We're making TSMC 5 nanometer class nodes, to go from 378 square millimeters to whatever we're proposing, some larger die with more memory, bus width and all that stuff. That's expensive. And I'm sure that's true. I'm sure making a 500 square millimeter die would make the 5080 a more expensive card to produce. But let's be real here, right? It is not costing Nvidia $1,000 US more to make a 5090 compared to a 5080. To go from 378 square millimeters to 750 and doubling the GDDR7 capacity, that's not $1,000, mate. Sorry, it's not $1,000 to do that.
My understanding is it's cheaper than it was when they did the 40 series.
Well, the wafers would be slightly cheaper to moderately cheaper. So
that was my understanding. I thought they were actually quite a bit cheaper. I don't have the facts and figures in front of me, but for some reason, that was the impression I had based on some past research. But anyway, my point is, to some degree, it should actually be cheaper than it was. So I don't know about the memory changes, but then did they even need to change the memory? Are we seeing? Obviously, we haven't sort of delved in or dived into memory scaling. I don't know if anyone else has. I haven't seen too much of that, but I haven't seen evidence that we needed the GDDR7 memory for this particular architecture and what they provided. Not sure
I mean, it doesn't look like it's providing significant gains. It looks like most of the scaling that we're seeing, at least in your benchmarking, is much more heavily related to the core configuration, so the cores and the clock speeds on those, compared to the memory. Like, there's a few games where the gains are pretty significant, but I've also seen some lower level benchmarks that seem to suggest that the latency has actually gone backwards with Blackwell. I'm not sure how accurate that is because I didn't look into it too deeply, but it seems that there are other factors at play with the memory side of things that may not have improved as significantly as just the raw bandwidth number, which again is pretty typical when you change memory generations. It's not just about improving raw bandwidth. There can be other factors as well, like latency, which impact it. So I don't know whether it was a requirement, but they went with it. And honestly, it's to go from 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory to 16 gigabytes of GDDR7 memory. We're not going to be talking about a huge hundreds upon hundreds of dollars difference. There would be a difference, but it's not creating a significant headache for the pricing of these products, especially when we're talking about $1,000 GPU. Maybe down the stack, if they're trying to make a $400 GPU with 16 gig of VRAM, maybe GDDR7 makes that more difficult. But there's a lot of flexibility in the $1,000 price range. And let's be honest, Nvidia just doesn't want to sacrifice the percentage margin that they're making with these cards. They don't want to say, well, we're going to have to make the GPU die $100 more expensive and give you $50 more of VRAM and sell the card for $1,000, thereby costing us $150 on each card. They're going, well, we can just shove out some crap and price it however we want, and fingers crossed people buy it. So that's what they've done.
And we're going to have to wait and see how that plays out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't expect this card to fly off the shelves, what they've done is gotten rid of all the 4080s from sale. So
Mhm.
it's not like you've really got an alternative if you want to spend $1,000 on an Nvidia GPU. In that sense, you'll be buying a 5080 because that's the option. But I think with these discussions, it's more about how many people that were not going to upgrade just blindly are going to change their mind and suddenly grab a 5080. I think the answer to that would be very low, even 0 people.
Yeah, it's going to be the people that still have a 3080, for example, and they saw the
Mhm.
4080, the price increase, what it offered, weren't very impressed with what they saw and thought, nah, you know what, I'm going to skip this generation. I'm sure the 5080 will be much better. 5080 comes along, not much better. So some of those people will cave and go, well, you know what? I've just been waiting so long now.
Yeah.
This thing just is struggling. 10 gigs of VRAM, not really enough, and just the raw performance, not enough to play these latest games. So I'm just going to have to pull the pin and get a 5080. So that I can see that being a real situation that quite a few people will be in. And that becomes a problem for Nvidia if what they're saying with getting these performance gains is extremely difficult now. I don't know that if true, and they are going to struggle with this moving forward, what the future of the company is, because if you get 4 or 5 more years down the track, and they're continuing to see these pretty weak gains, which I don't think is going to be the case, but if it is the case, then what's the incentive for a 5080 owner to buy a 6080 or a 7080 or an 8080? Like, what's the point if you're getting what used to be one generation's worth of performance uplift? It's taking 4 generations now to get there.
Yeah, you'd think GPU sales would slow significantly in that scenario, which again has always been the issue. It's how does Nvidia convince Nvidia GPU owners to upgrade? And
And frame generation, I guess, is what they're trying. That's the first attempt.
well, yeah, I mean it's an attempt. I think part of it is what you were talking about in the previous podcast as well, with the upsell. Like you slowly try and drag people up a bit by saying, well, price to price, you're not getting too much. But if you spend maybe $200 more, I don't know, the gains are looking pretty good if you spend $200 more. And eventually you'll hopefully drag people up from that spent $700 on a 3080, which again, most people weren't able to do for various reasons, but you know what I mean?
No,
$700 on a 3080, you try and drag them up to $1,000 because as you point out in the review, the 5080 is significantly faster than a 3080. It's just also quite a bit more expensive. Whereas the 5080, if that was a $700 GPU, it would be an amazing product. So
yeah, it's absolutely right. I laughed because I read quite a few comments on the previous video, and I always find when you say something like that, certain people will take it as like an absolute, like I'm saying absolutely everybody that used to buy $700 GPUs are now just automatically $1,000 GPU customers. Whereas
right.
we're not
Yep.
saying that at all. We're saying Nvidia's trying to drag up a percentage, the highest percentage they can, of
Yep.
people that once upon a time were comfortable spending $700 and now converting them to being comfortable with $1,000 because if everything keeps going well in their life, a couple of generations
Mhm.
later, hey, you're a $1,200 buyer now, you're a $1,600 buyer, and they just keep dragging them up. And, it was funny because I was reading the comments and some people were like, oh man, what Steve said there, that's me. Like I used to buy the $400 GPU, then I got the $600 one, now I bought the $800 one, I'm considering buying the $1,000 one, which you can see how that happens, right? Because people
Yeah.
want a game, they want an upgrade, and they just keep getting dragged up. And then there was a couple of other comments where people were like, you're so disconnected from reality, YouTubers. Like, I spent $400. There's no way that person's ever spending $700 or $800. But then we had people in the comments who were saying they were doing exactly that. And that's the point,
Yeah.
right? Like it's not a market wide thing. They're not getting people that were spending $200 to spend $1,000, but they're slowly pulling people up. And I guess as well, a lot more gamers would be my age and older now. So
Mhm.
middle age. Whereas previously, when I was younger, there was hardly anyone who was 40 that played computer games. It was such a rarity. Whereas
Yeah.
now it's very commonplace. And most people who are around 40, 50, if they've been working all their life, they usually have their finances pretty well under control by that point. Mortgages under control and whatever they've got. $1,000, $2,000 to spend on their hobby, especially when you work a 9 to 5 job. I'm sure a lot of the guys listening to this can relate. Like, you work your job, you come home. When you were a kid, you might have gone to the movies or done something. That stuff's so expensive now. If you can just fire up a video game, play for an hour or whatever, and Call of Duty or whatever your favorite game is with some friends from work or whatever, that's a great time, and it costs you next to nothing. So what Jensen says about the $10,000 PC, while excessive, if you're spending, especially someone who's middle-aged, around $10,000 on your hobby, which is peanuts really for a lot of people's hobbies, and that's not a disconnected YouTuber thing, like there's guys that are into cars and collectibles. How much, actually don't answer that question. I was going to ask how much you spend on Lego. Don't. That'll really kill the privileged YouTuber. But my point is, middle-aged guys tend to sink good amounts of money into their hobbies. And if your primary hobby is PC gaming and tinkering with your PC, if you spend $10,000 across a 5-year period, let's say, like if that's just how it works out, so average couple of grand every year or whatever it may be, it's not that much money for like an adult who...
Yeah, relative to other hobbies, yeah.
So it's almost like an age thing now. Like, think about it like cars. Your first car, typically speaking, not so great. Your next car might be a little bit better if you're not Tim, and so on and so forth. And by the time you get to 40, 50, you're usually driving a reasonably nice, relatively new car. Again, I'm generalizing here, but if you look around, this is generally how things play out. And I think they're looking at, like, for the young guys, and Vex, who makes pretty cool videos, and he made a great video with a friend on like ray tracing frame generation. It was like a blind test type thing. And at the end, his mate's like, but who buys these like meme cards? Who's spending $2,000? And Vex is just laughing. He's like, I think it's people older than us, which is the point I'm trying to make, right? Like, when you're a young guy in your early 20s like Vex, you're sort of, the $400 card. I mean, I remember when I was that age, spending $400 on a graphics card was crazy. And then you get in your 30s and you're like, $400, I'll get an $800 one. And you see where I'm going with this. The older you get, the more disposable income you have, the more expensive. So the graphics cards and whatever it is that you're buying becomes. So I think that's also playing into it as well. There's an older audience, a more mature audience now that are playing video games, which sounds a bit funny to say. But yeah, they just have more money to spend. So Nvidia's trying to capture that market and convince them that they should be spending their money on that and not, I don't know, car stuff or whatever, drones or whatever their hobby may be. Lego.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, that's always been why we haven't placed all that much focus on like how much the flagship card costs. Like whether it's $1,500, $1,600, now $2,000. There's always a market for that type of buyer that wants that product. The issue is more, what is someone who has spent $1,000 previously, or is even in the high end section, like how long are they going to have to wait to buy a new graphics card? What is being done to attract that sort of buyer, even if it is a high-end buyer, to buying a new product? And I think Nvidia, with this generation and the 40 series it applies to a little bit as well, is that they're almost operating in a bubble or a monopoly when I don't believe that the gaming market as a whole is an Nvidia monopoly, even though obviously for PC, desktop, AIB sales and stuff, Nvidia is the dominant player. There are still many ways to access gaming in general. And it doesn't have to be a PC, it can be a console. And now there's even alternate platforms that people are enjoying, like handheld devices. The Steam Deck, for example, you can play a whole Steam library. And yeah, you're not getting the frame rates and experience that you get on a PC, but it's still a low-cost entry point to gaming. And I think the issue that Nvidia is going to have longer term if they go down this path is that if you exit the lower tier market and only focus on middle-aged gamers with lots of money, for example, you're leaving still a significant hole at the lower parts, the $400 tier, which is where most people game, even just buying consoles or whatever. And I just don't believe that the experience that an RTX 5090 is providing you and that sort of product is going to be as large compared to the like a console than the price difference is, if you know what I mean, right? Like it's $2,000 just to buy the graphics card. Is that really that much better than buying a PS5 Pro, which costs $700 or whatever it is, $800, can't remember the price, for the entire system? And again, we talked in the previous podcast how next generation consoles are potentially only a couple of years away. Like, is Nvidia really going to be able to justify selling cards that are 10%, 5 to 10% faster in another generation when theoretically a next generation console will be launching, giving a much better gaming experience in whatever ways it provides at a much lower price point? And so, yeah, PC gaming is different to console gaming and there's all that, but eventually it gets to a point where someone looking at gaming is going, well, Nvidia only really offers these high-end expensive $1,000, $750 GPUs. So is it worth it for me to continue being a PC gamer, or should I buy a PlayStation or an Xbox, or maybe Steam will make their own console? There's certainly rumors and discussion about that. So they can do that they can service that market to a point, but I just don't think that in 2027, for example, if they delivered another 10% performance improvement, that a product like a 6080 would look all that attractive compared to the PlayStation 6. Just guessing what a PS6 would look like.
Yeah, I mean, that comes back to the point I was making. If they can get away with it for now, well, they've gotten away with it to this point. Whether they get away with it with the GeForce 50 series is yet to be seen. I think to a degree they'll get away with it. And then the next generation, we can really only speculate, because they could pull off quite a significant performance improvement, good improvement with cost per frame for the next generation. If they do, then this was just an unfortunate sort of blip, and happy days will resume. Possibly wishful thinking. If they can't do that, and that's what I'm saying, I think they're in big trouble. I think that's where it becomes really problematic for them, because first of all, yeah, it's hard to get people to upgrade. You really have to be offering, if you're offering small performance gains, they have to be at really attractive price points where people go, well, just stuff it. I want to get the new thing. I've been waiting this long and it's not that much faster, but it's not too expensive, so I'll do that.
Almost like a CPU upgrade, right? Like a 7800 XDD to 9800 XDD. You're not talking about dropping $1,000 to upgrade your CPU. You're talking about dropping, what is it, $450, $500?
Yeah, and if
it's 10, 20% faster, but we're talking half the price of the 5080.
Yeah, it's like at least half that again if you sell the current CPU. Yeah. So, yeah, we can really only speculate as to how that's all going to play out. But it would be a concern for me, for sure, if I was Nvidia, because stuff like mindshare and all that starts to erode when those periods of stagnation are prolonged. It also allows your competitors to catch up. It's not I'm not suggesting by any stretch of the imagination that Radeon would become faster than GeForce, because it seems like if they both hit that same wall, they'll hit that same wall. But if Radeon get their act together and make a more competitively priced product, then that's really what's going to turn all this around, isn't it? Because as it stands right now, you're saying, they can't abandon the low end, they can't have crap products there, but it's like, well, no, that's not true. They absolutely can. The 4060 is a piece of crap, and it outsold pretty much everything that AMD had to sell. Like the 4060 is an abomination. It's so bad, and yet one of the most popular GPUs. So, yeah. But that's because the RX 7600 is also a piece of crap. So, I mean, yeah, we talked about this on the last podcast. So AMD have to start offering GPUs that aren't also pieces of crap.
Yeah, and I think Nvidia is getting to a position now, and we're seeing a bit of sentiment in the comments relating to this, and not just on our videos, because obviously we have a certain audience on our videos, so I like to look across a wide variety of sources for this. But I think Nvidia is at risk of these sorts of releases starting to hurt their brand. I think across maybe the 10 series up to 30 series, Nvidia was able to significantly strengthen the GeForce brand, and with the launch of RTX and that sort of thing, they're able to really make Nvidia the face of PC gaming. That really helped them to gain market share and that sort of thing. And a lot of people had a really positive sentiment towards Nvidia GPUs. They're the best products. Anyone that's got them is sort of in the cool, good tier. And that played out maybe to the 40 series. People were sort of going, yeah, okay, that's a bit of a misstep, bit of a stumble, but there's a lot of mitigating factors. We'll see what they're doing with the next generation. And now that Nvidia's come out with another pretty weak generation, and people are seeing the results of 5080s and 5090s compared to what they did previously, I think there's a growing sentiment that is, turning a bit on Nvidia is probably the best way of putting it. Now, sort of seeing Nvidia as a company that is not really servicing gamers all that well with new products. And while a lot of those people are probably still going to go out and buy an Nvidia GPU anyway, even if they're complaining about the company and the products or whatever, because again, that's just the way the market is at the moment. But I don't think the brand is as strong as it was in the 30 series or 20 series era. Even though the 20 series was, again, not the best generation, I think their brand back then, there was a lot more excitement and interest around them. But they're cooking it a little bit, I feel, with these generations. Just seeing the amount of jokes being made about these products, the negative sentiment, the exploration of things like fake frames, which I didn't even use fake frames in my exploration of multi-frame generation because I don't necessarily agree with using the term fake frames, but that has clearly taken hold among a lot of gamers. I don't know. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I think Nvidia is also aware of this situation, and were aware that it was going to take place, which is why they scrambled and tried so hard to offer something extra with like multi-frame generation. Like, what can we do to make the 50 series special? What, we're not doing it through the hardware. So what software can we add? How can we make this special and basically make it so it doesn't become a mockery? And so they had frame generation. They're like, well, let's just do more of that. Looks like there are some significantly impressive improvements with DLSS 4 in terms of upscaling, but that doesn't just apply to the 50 series. So it's not really a win there for the 50 series. It's more of just a GeForce win, or at least an RTX GeForce win. So yeah, I think they've been well aware that this is happening, but at the same time, the greed or the need to maintain these ludicrous profit margins has outweighed the concern for the damage and potentially long-term damage done to the brand. And you see this with all these major corporations, this sort of thing happen, where if they just had have given a little bit more, cut into those profit margins just a little bit by either offering more VRAM or, slightly better configurations, and really they didn't have to be that much better to get away with it. Again, that's the embarrassing part. Like, they didn't have to be that much better to get away with it, because we saw it with the 5090. Yeah, it was disappointing, mostly because of the price, but we were getting, we found 27% performance uplift on average, which we got bashed by a lot of people on the last podcast. Like, there were a lot of upset, I guess, Nvidia fans saying, it's the fastest GPU though. It's still 27% faster. Like, that's still a good chunk, a good performance uplift. I guess you have to ignore the 25% price increase to come to that conclusion. I don't agree with those people at all, but a 27% performance uplift on average isn't nothing. And if they had have achieved that across the product stack, then I think people would be like, it's a bit disappointing, but it's not terrible. It's not a failed generation. We are getting some kind of improvement, especially if like 16 gigabytes of VRAM became the minimum for GPUs priced over, let's say $400. Let's go $400. I wanted to say 300, but I'll go 400. So they still could have I guess they were just hoping that stuff like multi-frame generation would wow everyone, and they would ignore the fact that they're not getting more VRAM and the cost per frame's not really improved, at least not significantly. But multi-frame generation just ain't it. Like, they can interpolate all the frames they want. It's a very cool, high-tech, advanced, never seen before really frame smoothing technology. So again, we're not saying it's garbage and shouldn't be developed and shouldn't be further developed. I think it's potential to go somewhere and potentially be really useful in the future. But as it stands, extremely limited usefulness, let's say. And for some people, like myself, it's not useful at all.
Yeah, I think NVIDIA's really left the door open here a bit. And as you say, like, their unwillingness to give 10% more than what they're currently giving is just leaving the door open even more for AMD or Intel, but not they'll have a product in this price range, but to come in with some sort of product that could be compelling. Because let's be honest, the 5080 is not that much faster than the 4080 and 4080 Super, and a lot of the performance rumors are suggesting that AMD's fastest GPU is probably going to be somewhere in the range of a 7900 XT to 7900 XTX, which is not that much slower than a 5080, which means that for potentially, if those rumors are accurate, and maybe, who knows, maybe they'll be pretty good, potentially AMD will have the ability to compete with the majority of NVIDIA's product stack. Whereas previously, when we were thinking about this discussion, when the rumors were happening, I don't know, 6 months ago, the talk was more something like a 5080 would be more like a 4090 level of performance, which would be much harder for AMD to achieve with the configurations and rumors that we were hearing. But the fact that it's not that and isn't that compelling in terms of cost per frame or other features or more VRAM and so on, it allows AMD an opportunity to compete across more of the range than I think many of us were expecting prior to this generation. So, for example, right, like if either Nvidia made a more favorable configuration, like we were talking about earlier in the podcast, they beefed it up, so larger die, that sort of thing. Again, it would have been pretty difficult for AMD to compete with the 5080 competitor sort of product. Or if they had made the 5080 compellingly cheap, like it wasn't $1,000, maybe it was $800 or something like that. It was more of a 4070 Ti Super level of price. Then again, becomes a bit more difficult to compete. People would have seen those value increases relative to the 4080 and 4080 Super and gone, yeah, it's not too bad. Nvidia's doing something for gamers this generation. But the way they've set the market at the moment is there's a lot of that negative sentiment of they're not offering us anything with Blackwell. Blackwell's the worst GPU generation that Nvidia's provided, which, again, I don't necessarily agree with. I still believe the 40 series is worse, at least based on what we've seen so far. But maybe we can get into that a little bit more. But
yeah, I don't think I agree with you on that one. But go on.
Well, I guess my position on this, I was looking back over all of the products when they first came out. So, for example, the RTX 4080 was worse cost per frame than the RTX 3080 at launch. So people buying a 3080 wanting to upgrade, you're actually getting worse value with that product. Then there was the 4070 Ti, which had an inadequate amount of VRAM, just 12 gigabytes at $800, and the cost per frame wasn't significantly different to a 3070 or 3080 type of product. So it was a little bit better value, but in the single digit sort of range. The same can be said for the 4070, though that was probably one of the better products. But I believe at launch, you said that it was about an 8% improvement in cost per frame relative to the 3070. So 4070 to 3070, about 8% better cost per frame. Then we had the 4060 Ti, which didn't have enough VRAM, didn't improve the performance over the 3060 Ti really, and so had basically no improvement in cost per frame. We've already talked about why the 4060 was bad. Again, not much of an improvement in value, less VRAM than the 3060, and it was a little cheaper, but the performance wasn't that different. So that's not a good generation. So to me, I would say the majority of those cards were bad or even worse propositions than their predecessors. So for Blackwell to be worse, it's a hard bar to pass. Like, that's pretty bad in my opinion. But I don't know. Do you disagree with that?
It's tough because there's the time factor as well. And I also factor in the fact that you're saying the 40 series was so bad. And then on the back of a so bad series, we're sitting here going, this is underwhelming and sucks. Like, if the 40 series was so bad, it should be relatively easy for the 50 series not to be underwhelming and suck. Whereas if the 50 series really could slot into the 40 series, there's a few different.
Well, part of that is that they corrected some aspects of the 40 series with the Super product. So the 4070 Ti Super fixed the VRAM, the 4080 Super fixed the price of that product. I was talking more about the launch of the 40 series was not good.
Well, I'm looking at the RTX 4080 review data, okay? So
yeah.
MSRP data. The 4080 doesn't look so bad. Let me come up with a couple of numbers here for you real quick. So it averaged 111 FPS in our day one review, and that made it 52% faster than the 3080.
Yeah.
Now, of course, it was 71% more expensive, so that's not good. However, I think, and I think we made a point of this at the time, once you get up around the $1,000 mark, the value side of things we don't weigh as heavily, even though people get really upset that we talk about the value of something like an RTX 5090, because you can't write off value altogether. But I don't think we weight our opinions as heavily on value as we would at the opposite end of the market, where
Sure.
sort of it's more about the performance. But of course, you still have to pay money for it. So I feel like talking about the price. But anyway, where I'm going with this is, let's say the RTX 3090, because I think we can agree the 3090 Ti was just beyond dumb.
Yeah.
So compared to the 3090, the 4080 was 32% faster, which is more than we're seeing from the 5090 over the 4090.
Yes, that's true. Yeah.
And it was
that is a point.
and it was $300 US cheaper, which meant upon release, if you factor in the MSRP pricing, the RTX 4080 was roughly 40% better value than the previous generation flagship.
But that's not that unusual, because the 3070 was roughly the same performance as the 2080 Ti.
No, I'm not saying it's good. Make no mistake, the 40 series sucked. But what I'm saying is, where's the 40% improvement in terms of price for this generation?
Well, not getting it compared to any product, really. I mean, maybe you'd have to go down to like, what is a 5070 going to look like relative to a 4090?
I think in language that you like to use, I could put it this way. The GeForce 40 series is a particular type of turd sandwich.
Yeah.
And the 50 series is a slightly different flavored turd sandwich. And we're arguing over which turd sandwich tastes the best.
Well, yes. Effectively, yes.
That's what's going on here. We're arguing about turd sandwiches.
Like, it's not good for Blackwell to be slightly better than a very bad GPU generation, right?
That's my point. That's exactly my point. Like, if it was 40% better, right? I would be very happy with that. You'd also have to temper that excitement with the fact that, okay, look, this is a good step forward. Yeah, I think we'd be all round positive. But at the same time, you could say, well, the previous generation did suck. But I don't think anyone would be complaining or making that comparison, but it would be a factor that you would, I guess you wouldn't be saying the GeForce 50 series is the best generation ever, like back to big gains. I don't think that would be happening. People would be very happy with the 40% like performance or value improvement, but no one would be handing the GeForce 50 series the award for the best ever GeForce series, I guess, because turd sandwich before it.
Yes. So, yeah, I mean, it doesn't really matter whether the 40 series or 50 series, which one was slightly worse. I just still think that there's a lot of not good 40 series products. So whether or not, if we see the whole lineup, that it's going to be the case. But I think the way things are headed right now, and I don't know, maybe they'll correct some of the lower tier products based on feedback. But
well, the 5070, what is it? It's $50 off for the same product, basically.
It looks that way. It is very much looking that way. Well, I mean, the 4070 right now is about a $550 product anyway.
Well, that's actually true. Yeah. Yep.
So I think it's got slightly more cores than a 4070. It's more like a 4070 Super in terms of its configuration, but it doesn't exactly make it that much more of a favorable comparison. Obviously, the 4070 Super was $600, but yeah, I mean, the things that they've announced so far are not exactly pointing to a compelling generation. No, they always have the chance to take feedback on board as things are going and release slightly more compelling products. I don't think that'll happen at all. Like, I don't think that'll happen. But again, I think it's, as we've said, it's more of a competition thing now. Nvidia just taking full advantage of their market leading position. That's just really it. They've effectively won the GPU war as things stand right now in terms of the market share that they're getting, and so they're acting like a winner.
Yeah, we're sitting here saying the current generation sucks. It's not worth buying. Like, all the reviewers have said their piece. It's not just us. The vast majority of reviewers and tech enthusiasts within the community, I think we're all pretty well on the same page. So now it's like, are we right? Is it going to sell poorly, or does the hype train for GeForce GPUs continue and people buy them anyway?
Yeah, not sure.
That's what we have to wait and see.
Yeah, and I think, as we sort of mentioned throughout this podcast, over time it will be more and more difficult for Nvidia to provide significant gains that you would have seen from things like a 10 series generation or a 30 series generation, even though that was spoiled, obviously, by crypto mining and that sort of thing. But it will become more difficult to achieve those sorts of gains, and there will be a period of time where settling into maybe 15 to 20% generational gains is going to be pretty standard, more in line with what you see on the CPU side of things. But again, I think the reason why lower gains right now are more acceptable on the CPU side is because CPUs aren't as expensive. So it's not as much of an investment to chase 20% gains generation over generation, or 15% gains or whatever. The investment that you're putting into a mid-range CPU is generally in the range of $200 to $300. Like, it's really not that much. And so, yeah, it's not that bad if you have to wait 4 or 5 years. Yeah, you may only be getting a modest performance gain between a couple of generations, but you're only outlaying $200 to $300 of cash to get that upgrade. I think if we're settling into 10, 20% gains generation on generation, but also Nvidia is trying to charge $1,000 to $2,000 for their best products, you're going to see a lot fewer people being happy with that sort of performance gain in that sort of price range, because the outlay each time you're achieving that 20% is so much higher than you would see from other product categories where you're getting that sort of gain.
Yeah, I don't disagree. That's why I was saying to you, it's going to be multiple generations before people pull the trigger on that upgrade. So that means there's less people buying, and that's problematic. But I think, speaking to the unhappiness of the reviews and gamers at large, I think that there's multiple reasons. So obviously, the performance gain is underwhelming, and that sucks. But I think other large contributing factors to this is stuff like what we saw at CES, like marketing. And this was the same thing that hurt Zen 5 as well. Like, and it's a repeat of the Zen 5 conversation where I said if AMD had to just come out, been honest, and said what Zen 5 was designed for and what it did, it would have been different. And some people, argue that shouldn't affect reviews and whatnot. Like, the first party setting expectations very clearly shouldn't influence the tone of reviews, which I guess that's a point of view. But again, if Nvidia had have come out and just said, yeah, guys, it's getting really hard. These GPUs are really big and really complicated now. Manufacturing processes are getting more difficult to, improve, let's just say. So the gains aren't going to be as big as they once were, but we're still working hard. We're still pushing for gains. But, this generation is not going to be as significant as you've seen before. Put that in marketing language, okay, that dresses it up a bit but is still honest, okay? Opposed to gamers, the 5070 is now a 4090. Like, come on, give me a break. Like, and all their absolute garbage trash tier slides and things they put together. Because we saw it on X and other platforms. How many people came away hyped? Like, they were screaming from the rooftops, so excited. Blackwell was just the bee's knees. It was going to blow everything else away. And, for $550, you were getting previous generation GPU performance that cost $1,600 or more. Like, insane, awesome. Take my money, please. And then it comes out shortly after, that was all the biggest load of bullshit ever. He's just been not spoon feeding you, like one of those big old mulch rakes, just shoveling that. And
I think it was debunked like an hour later, if that.
Well, it was on sort of the mainstream audiences and the people that are,
yeah,
really
okay.
into
It was debunked by us, for example, but maybe not mainstream audiences. Yeah.
Yeah. Like the word eventually got out there anyway. So I think that's a huge problem. And it's what we've talked about with AMD's marketing. And I think because GeForce GPUs have generally delivered, the extra BS on top has just been people, even when it's been pointed out by us or Gamers Nexus, people have just got angry that you're pointing it out. Like, stop trying to water down the excitement for this product. It's an awesome product. So don't address the bullshit. You're
especially
not
like if a 4090 was a lot faster than a 3090.
Yeah. So you're just wrecking the enthusiasm. You're negative. You're not a fun time. Stop it. Which I can sort of understand. But now that the fun time isn't there, then the market, they're not getting away with the BS to nearly the same degree that they were, and that'll continue to become a huge problem for them.
I think though there's a level of honesty where, if you're saying Nvidia needs to come out and say, we're trying really hard, I still think there needs to be evidence of that happening. And so from a CPU perspective, for example, if AMD had come out and said, well, there's not a lot of gains to be had, Zen 5 kind of is what it is, so be it. This is the gains that we're able to achieve. Then you can sort of look at the product and say, well, okay, fair enough. We've assessed the factors. There's not a lot else that you could have done with that product. Maybe change the core count a little bit or change the price a little bit, maybe to make the products a bit more compelling. But so be it. The single thread performance is what it is, which is a large factor, especially for gaming, right? With NVIDIA GPUs, if they had come out and they'd honestly said, right, the RTX 5070 is the best product that we could make for $550 US because we're so limited in XYZ reasons. Do you think that's really going to be the honest truth? Because I believe that making that card for 12 gigabytes of VRAM with the configuration they made it is NVIDIA not doing the best that they could do. They could have made that product better. So they have to kind of factor that in as well.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I think at the end of the day, gamers aren't going to be happy, right? They want big performance gains for no money. So there's sort of the unreasonable customer, and then there's what you can do. It's like, if you couldn't do the thing that I wanted you to do for me, Tim, that's one thing. But then to lie about saying that you did the thing I wanted you to do and you did it super good, I feel like that just makes it worse, right? Like,
oh, yeah, it does.
And especially when, first of all, the absolute garbage you're spewing on your CES presentation is going to be debunked the second the presentation is over. Like, it's being debunked in real time. How helpful is that? I guess they do it because they think they're pulling the wool over the consumer's eyes. And while we might, make a big song and dance about it, Gamers Nexus and others, there is a net benefit. Like, they're still selling more people on GeForce GPUs than they would if they were being honest, which is kind of the whole point of marketing. But I'm just not sure that's the case. And I think this is the first time that it probably hasn't been.
It certainly affects the general perception and excitement around the products, because as I sort of said earlier in the podcast, I think the moves NVIDIA's made has hurt their brand, or at least is starting to hurt their brand with this generation, and they could have avoided that with more honest marketing. And again, it's always marketing, right? Like, it's not going to ever meet the true standards of what we would be able to claim in a video reviewing the product. Marketing is always going to be cherry picking certain things, and we understand that to a level. It's just how egregious that is where we get super concerned about it. Like, for example, in Intel's Arc B580 presentation, there were some claims, and they probably undershot a few of the things in there, but on the whole, it felt like that presentation was Intel's attempt at being honest about what the product was. Whereas with NVIDIA's presentation, you get a very different vibe and feeling out of it. You sort of know immediately, if you have experience looking at these products, that what they're saying is not truthful. And so again, like that's why it's so easy to debunk within seconds after the presentation ends. Whereas with something like Intel's presentation, and again, we could probably talk about the B580, but like I felt like they tried with that presentation to give gamers an accurate reflection of the product, and that did resonate with people when they saw what Intel were claiming. Even factoring in like Intel might cherry pick the examples a little bit. Once people stripped that layer away, the results were still positive. Whereas when you strip the BS layer away from Nvidia's products, you tend to find very underwhelming things, and especially has been the case with the 50 series. Do you want to talk about the B580 a little bit?
Yeah, I can't even remember what ammunition I had for the B5. I mean, it was the pretty obvious stuff. So obviously B580, very exciting product upon release. As you were saying, pretty closely reflected what Intel were claiming, which seemed to be setting it up for a pretty great product, slightly better than RTX 4060 performance or thereabouts, let's say, with 12 gigabytes of VRAM for $250, which is a good chunk of change that you're saving there, at least $50 US. So that's all good. It's really what people have been begging for, have been starved, deprived of at the entry level sort of gaming segment. So ticked all those boxes. We got it. You've done extensive ARC testing. Pretty good across a wide range of games. A few hiccups here and there, but certainly usable.
Yeah.
And I think, the B580, if you could get it for $250 US, you're going to have a good experience, a good time. So that was the initial B580 impression. There's the overhead issue, which has some pretty severe consequences for future ARC GPUs if that's not addressed, which came a bit later. But again, if you have a reasonable CPU on a modern platform, realistically, like you've got an LJ 1700 or an AM5 processor, which admittedly relatively new, kind of hurts the budget aspect of things. A bit of a downer there, but it doesn't completely kill the product.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a hiccup along the way. But we're like, I don't even know, what are we now? We're how many weeks out are we? 6, 7 weeks?
6 weeks, yeah.
6 weeks
6
at
or
this
7
point.
weeks. Yep.
And if I head over to Newegg and type in B580 real quick, they are still out of stock. I just wanted to make sure they were, because I checked a few days ago. So the cheapest one's $332.
Well, you're not buying it at that price, are you?
That's real bad. Yeah, has to be $250 max. $250, goodbye, good product, get it. So yeah, all these weeks later, I think at the 6-week mark, I know people have been saying paper launch and this and that since day one, which I wasn't a huge fan of. Whether you're right, like, turns out you're right, but it's kind of like guessing and then saying I was right, or just having a hunch, or it's really got to be proven to be the case. And I think now we're pretty well at the point where we can say that Intel hasn't delivered with the B580. It's been at this point, epic fail.
Yes.
Really disappointing. It's a complete and utter fail at this point, because while available in Australia, and some people were quick to point that out in the last podcast, the value's terrible. Like, it's more expensive than an RTX 4060.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I was just having a look at that right now. You can buy one for 470 Australian dollars, which is the card should be in a direct conversion 440 Australian dollars. That's $250 converted plus tax.
Sure.
But the RTX 4060, for example, you can buy for $470 as the cheapest version. So the exact same price as the B580. So and this is an issue that we've heard a lot from our European viewers, for example, basically saying this card is completely dead on arrival in Europe. The pricing is the same or worse than the competing Radeon and Nvidia GPUs. So there's just no point buying it. It's really only in the US where this card makes sense based on the pricing.
But you can't get it in the US and haven't been able to.
But you can't get it in the US. So
it's meant to be 17% cheaper than
that's what makes it good. That is the thing that makes the B580 good and getting
one of the things. The other thing that makes it good is the 12 gigabytes of VRAM, but that alone. So it should be about $390 in Australia, not $470.
Yes, relative to the 4060. Yes,
relative to the 4060. So the only real advantage it has over the 4060 is the additional VRAM.
Yeah.
going from 8 to 12 gigabytes, which makes the product much more usable in modern games where we're seeing VRAM requirements become problematic even at 1080p. And you could just turn textures right up and other VRAM hungry things that typically don't affect the compute side of things too much. So you can just, Space Marine 2, 4K texture pack runs a treat on a B580, whereas you start to run into problems on 8 gigabyte cards. So it has the VRAM advantage. It should have the price advantage. And then it's quite literally inferior in virtually every other way.
Yep.
So driver support's not nearly as good. CPU overhead's not even in the same league. And then compatibility, all that sort of stuff. Obviously, DLSS, very strong support now. Ray tracing, completely irrelevant in my opinion on those products. Completely and utterly irrelevant. Don't talk to me about ray tracing on a B580 or an RTX 4060. It's not it. Anyway, 6-ish weeks out. Price sucks. Availability's basically zero where, well, you can either buy it at a price that makes no sense to do so.
Yeah.
Or, at the price it should be, unavailable, which means there's no availability. Because if it's not $250 US, there's no availability. Like, you're not buying that product. And also, since then, the RX 7600, which really is the primary competitor because the GeForce GPU absolutely stinks. $300 for that thing sucks. Last I looked, you could buy one currently available for $250. There's an ASRock Challenger model currently available on Newegg. And then there's a few other models for like $260. But yeah, $250. So the same price as the MSRP of the B580. So if you wanted to buy an entry-level GPU right now, you should be buying yourself. If you wanted to buy a new, let's say your used market sucks or whatever, you'd buy the ASRock Challenger Radeon RX 7600 for $250.
It's kind of like how much has Intel here suffered from their own success of making a product that people actually wanted to buy, because again, it's not available, but demand clearly was better than they were expecting. Did they really just not make anywhere near as many GPUs as they needed to?
Well, how many have they been selling at $250 though? I've not seen them come back into stock in the US. Are people getting them?
That's what I'm saying. Maybe they thought the card was going to be such a flop that they only made like a very limited amount.
So it's essentially a lie. It's another marketing lie in a different direction. They're lying less on the performance and more on the price and availability, like what they're actually making.
Well, that's right. I mean, if they'd looked at the sales of their A series, for example, the A770, that card cannot have been selling well. Like, they would have been seeing it basically a flat line at zero for sales and gone, well, can't be too many people interested in this B series product. So then they made obviously a very low amount of these cards, and then they priced it unfortunately well. And suddenly people can't buy it. I don't know. Is that the reason?
Yeah. What happened is, right, then this should be a lesson for AMD. I wanted to actually mention when we were talking about AMD with the upcoming GPUs, if AMD can't make something, if AMD cannot get, I'm going to say it now, if AMD can't get positive reviews this generation, they're done. Radeon's never making it ever. They're done. Like, I
agree, 100%. Not a hot take. Not a hot take.
This is it. This is do or die. If they cannot make a highly compelling product for this generation with positive reviews, they're done. Radeon's dead, never to return. This is it. Mm-hmm. So,
and just quietly, I know people at AMD were not happy when I made that video about how AMD keeps stuffing up. If AMD stuffs up again, just imagine what video I will make. Just imagine how much worse that video will be, because I'll be compelled to make it and I will destroy the company, because everything we've been saying now, they have so much evidence, so many things to have learnt. I totally agree with you that if they cannot take all of that, every single thing happening, and not launch a compelling product, what can you say? Like, yeah, they're done.
Yeah, I mean, your video will be the least of their worries.
Well, yeah, that's true. But I mean, I thought that video was pretty bad then. But if they can't do it this time around, I mean,
yeah. So, speaking to that point, right? AMD has struggled to get positive reviews, not just from us, pretty well industry wide, and they obviously haven't been accepted. So there's the reviewer thing. Agree or disagree with me, but reviewers aside, they clearly haven't struck a chord with consumers. Like they're not selling the cards. They're not doing well. There's no hype around the brand. The brand has no real presence. Partners are pulling out. It's bad on all fronts.
There's negative connotations with Radeon.
Yeah, it's bad on all fronts. They haven't been able to work it out. It's an unsolvable mystery to them how to market and sell GPUs. They just don't know how to do it. Intel comes along with a inferior product, and to circle back or take one step back, A770. You mentioned the A770, and Intel did a big old AMD with that product.
Yeah.
They launched it into a market at an uncompetitive price with uncompetitive performance. They priced it against, I don't know, I can't even remember. I think it was like the Radeon RX 6600 was a better value deal.
Yeah, 6600 XT, 6700 XT, that sort of thing.
Yeah, basically the 6600 series, pick one, was a better value option. I remember Intel arguing with me at the time, and I'm like, well, I'm not going to recommend an A770 when it costs more and the performance doesn't justify, so you've done a Radeon. It's an uncompetitive product. Somehow you've managed to do that. And then they learn their lesson. They come back with the B580, which apparently is a product they couldn't actually make at that price anyway. But they sort of duped us all by working out an actual attractive price point for that product. And had they actually been able to deliver on it, it would have been a huge success, massive. But they worked that out, and they, announced the price, the product, the
forgot
performance.
To make the card.
They forgot to make the card.
They didn't let the factory know to start making them. They're like, nah, no need.
Well, it's either that or they genuinely can't really sell it for that price. Like people were claiming they're selling it at a loss, which we weren't super sold on that. I think the truth is no one knows the truth, really. All we know is
I think it doesn't matter. Like the GPU division as a whole loses money. So...
Yeah, well, they've failed to deliver what they said they were going to do. And
better to release a compelling card people want at a small loss than release a card at an expensive price that literally gets zero sales.
Well, yeah. I mean
business people probably don't think that because they're like, zero sales at no loss equals no loss in dollars, and small loss on cards equals loss, therefore bad. But I'm talking about the long-term play, obviously.
Yeah, I think intelligent business people would understand that. I think they would.
It's an investment.
Well, yeah, you have to build a brand, and that's exactly what Intel's doing. And it's really what AMD is still in the process of doing, whether they're rebuilding the brand that they had and then trying to continue to build that brand, and they've just been going about it the wrong way. So anyway, yeah, two conclusions there. B580 complete fail, but should have been a success. And if Radeon can't pull it off this generation, there's probably going to be no point reviewing future Radeon GPUs.
Yeah, I think the issue with AMD as well is that it's not even that hard. Like, I feel like I'm going crazy saying on this podcast so many times about exactly what the company needs to do to get people interested in their products. Like, it's not challenging to price a Radeon GPU. Like, for example, if AMD comes out with a product that is in every way as good as an RTX 5080, you cannot price it at $950 US. You can't just make it the Nvidia GPU minus $50. Secondly, the card might not even be that good. So there's that. But you know what I mean, right? Like,
yeah.
Like, if they, for some miracle, managed to make an RTX 50 level of product, features and everything, the maximum they can sell that card for is $800. Maximum. And I'm assuming the card probably isn't going to have the same level of features. It has to be below that. This is not rocket science. If your card is going to be as good as a 5070 Ti in performance, ray tracing, maybe it's a little worse on features, it can't be $700. It has to be lower than that. It's not hard. Like, it's not difficult. Maybe there's not enough margin on the cards to make those products attractive, which is just a fail on the hardware front. It's not hard. The 7900 XT was not a $900 product. It's not rocket science that price was never going to work.
Yeah. And you're right. And we've seen, and the A770 is another case study of this. It's another example of this. You have to nail the day one pricing.
Yeah.
I can't stress that enough. So you look at the A770 as an example, and I think, well, it looks to me, I can't actually remember the MSRP for that card, but it launched at about $350. So it must have been $350.
Mm-hmm.
I forget. The A770, forgive me, but I don't remember much about it. That's how much of a fail it was upon launch. There was no excitement around it. There was no interest in it. It was an uncompelling product at an uncompetitive price. That's why it was uncompelling. And therefore, we did no follow-up content. But I believe the MSRP was about $350 because I'm looking on PC Part Picker and I'm looking at the pricing history. And they all started around $350. But before long, they were down at $270. The ASRock Challenger regularly sold at $270, which it was possibly a more compelling product there. And it got as low as like $230 for a 16 gigabyte graphics card. Regularly sold for under $300. Now, how competitive it was there against like an RX 7600 and 4060, I'm not sure. But if it was going to be relatively competitive, it already failed. It stumbled out of the gate at $350.
People forget about it. Yeah. People see the reviews for $350, and with the limited brain capacity of humans, they're like, poof, not wasting my time thinking or remembering that. It's gone.
Yes. Yeah, it's in the garbage tier.
Yeah.
So, it takes effort to go get it out of the garbage tier and work it out. I don't think it ever became competitive again, like maybe at $230, but that's super cheap, and it looks like that was only for a run out type period. But again, what I don't want to see is I do not want to see AMD pick a price. So let's say $700, and then 1 month, 2 months, 3 months later, it's $680. I don't care that it's only $20. If it could be $20, my point is, if in the next 6 months it can be $20 cheaper, start there and never discount the price.
Yep.
At this point with Radeon GPUs, every dollar counts.
100%.
So please do not launch it at $500 and then 6 months later it can now be $450. That's dumb. Don't do that. I know it might be a crystal ball situation. There's probably a lot of factors that I'm not considering, but just don't do that. If there's any chance you think you could sell it for $50 less within months after release, just start there. Like it's worth taking the hit. That's what we've been saying for ages. You've got to build this brand, and nothing will be more infuriating than seeing this card launch and be like, it's okay. It's not too bad. And then 3, 4, 5 months later, there's just $50 knocked off the price, because you don't see Nvidia doing that unless they absolutely have to. But you know what I mean, right? Like, it's frustrating. And we've even seen it before. Remember when the 1700 XT launched and all the AMD defenders were saying, there's just no way they can sell it for less than $900. That'd be selling it at a loss. They're doing it as cheap as they can. Everything's more expensive. You guys don't understand. It was like a month later, it's heavily discounted. Oh, everything just got cheaper overnight. Oh, that's convenient. That's lucky. But at that point, it's a waste, because you look at from the RTX 5080 review, if you look at the MSRP, the 7900 XTX looks a bit crap. In terms of value, it is better than the 4080 quite substantially. The 4080 Super, it's about the same as.
Yep.
Marginally better in terms of value. Upon release, it's offering more AMD's mid-range type value, RTX 4070 type value is where AMD's flagship sits. So it is certainly better value, but we said the 4080 was kind of crap. The 4080 Super was more where it should be. And if you take those MSRPs, AMD's offering a few percent more performance. And then even if you look at your mid 2024 pricing when it dropped down to $900, which was $100 off, it's offering a bit better value than the 4080 Super. I'm not actually sure how much better value. I have to work that out. But it matches the value of the RTX 5080. And a lot of people are saying the 5080 reviews were a great advertisement for the Radeon GPU, the 7900 XTX. I don't know if I agree with that.
No, I wouldn't buy a 7900 XTX after seeing a 5080 review. I'd buy a 5080 if those are the only two options.
Yeah, exactly. You're right. Yeah, it's $100 cheaper for the Radeon GPU, but in terms of cost per frame, that makes it marginally better.
It's marginally better for rasterization, and the Nvidia GPU is better at literally everything else, except for VRAM capacity, I guess. But literally everything else.
The VRAM capacity is not super relevant at
it's
that.
way faster at ray tracing. It has, which you would consider using at a 5080 level product. Like, it's capable of ray tracing. The 7900 XTX is worse than a 4070 at ray tracing. So I mean,
yeah, it's thereabouts. But yeah, typically it depends on the game. But yeah, I think saying 4070 is probably generous. So yeah, in terms of value across a mostly raster based lineup, it's 2.5% better. So
it's not mind blowing, is it?
Well, we've said the 5080 sucks and is underwhelming.
Mm-hmm.
And then here's the 7900 XTX being, I'm 2.5% better value. Get out.
Mm-hmm. You wouldn't buy it for that price. No.
So I'd love to know what price I said that GPU would have to be on my day one review. I'm going to try and find that. If you've got something else to talk about quickly while I do a search.
Yeah, I think you said...
I'm going to try and find this.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've said before the issue with AMD GPU pricing is them overrating the quality of their own products. I think they've focused too heavily on rasterization performance, as if that's the only factor people are buying GPUs for these days, and ignoring all the other stuff. Even if AMD believes that most gamers aren't going to use ray tracing, or aren't going to use video encoding, or aren't going to use frame generation, or whatever the feature is, I still feel like a lot of people buy NVIDIA GPUs because they might use those features. So they'll go, I could benefit because I only play multiplayer games really from the 10% better raster that Radeon offers, but I might use ray tracing. I might use video encoding. I might want to try out frame generation. And so they factor all those other things in, and then it turns out they just buy a GeForce GPU. I think if Radeon's serious about this next generation of products, they can't do that. They've got to make sure they're factoring in every aspect of their product, every single feature, every single thing that someone could use a GPU for when coming up with the final price, and not having, I guess, horse blinkers on to things that are just rasterization performance, which again, for some people is the only feature that they would consider. It's just there's a lot more things going into GPUs these days. So that's the reason why, for example, a 7900 XTX at $900 doesn't look that good compared to a 5080 at $1,000, even though it's slightly better value in terms of cost per frame for rasterization performance. And that's the reason why I personally wouldn't buy it at that price. But yeah, like a next generation version of a 7900 XTX would have to be a lot below $900 for it to be a compelling purchase compared to a 5080.
Mm-hmm.
You're probably looking at least $200 off that level.
Yeah, what's interesting is, for my day one review content, the 7900 XTX is clearly aged better than the 4080, which is interesting. I haven't really done a deep dive into that. But on the day one review, the 7900 XTX was 17%. I think it was 17% better value. Or it's at least, I've said 17% less. It's unclear with the language here, but basically I said it needs to be at least 20% cheaper, if not 25% cheaper. So $900 US would be a more appropriate price, like the most they could charge for that product, which is what they're charging today.
Yeah.
The problem is, in that period of time, the GeForce GPU competitor has dropped by $200. So from when I said that, the Radeon GPU has become $100 cheaper, but the GeForce GPU has become $200 cheaper. So that's a big problem. Yeah. So really, it needs to be a lot cheaper again.
Yeah, I mean, I think we were having a discussion, I don't think it was on the podcast, it was maybe at some other point, about how, AMD is even struggling to sell 7900 XTs right now for around $700. And that's about a 20% discount? I think 7800 XT is similar as well, $470 for that model in your 5080 review current pricing versus the 4070 Super, which is up around $600. And again, like the 4070 Super significantly outsells the 7800 XT, despite it being, again, more of a gap in terms of cost per frame than those other models. So yeah, they're sort of setting the tone that, 15, 20% is maybe not enough for people to really turn heads. But then again, like, we don't know what the interest would have been like in those products had the current prices been the launch prices. So there might have been a bit more interest in a 7800 XT if it was $470 versus $500.
Yeah, based on the new data, for the 1700 XTX to be a must-buy, get it instead of the RTX 5080, it has to be $750 thereabouts.
And that's for rasterization only, right?
Yeah. Well, I think but that's a general recommendation. I mean, we would still say if you care about ray tracing, or even especially if you primarily care about ray tracing performance, then obviously you'd have to get an equivalent GeForce GPU. So at $750, you'd be looking at like a
4070 Ti sort of thing, Ti Super, I think.
Yeah, I haven't actually. Oh, the Ti Super is $780. So yeah, basically, yep. Yeah, so you'd be looking at a 4070 Ti Super. But that's it really. It's $900 and it needs to be $750 in today's market for it to be a compelling buy where you would recommend it. And that's again ignoring the need or demand or want for ray tracing, however you want to characterize it.
Yeah, and the other features. So it's like for rasterization only, it has to be $750.
Yeah, I think at $750, it becomes more of, as I said, a general recommendation. As in, I would be saying to people, this is absolutely a personal opinion because it has to be, but I don't think ray tracing is prolific enough. I don't think it is impactful enough, transformative enough to justify spending that extra money if you're more budget conscious. I don't think spending the extra $250 to get an RTX 5080 is worth it. Now, of course, that's my opinion. You're welcome to research and look at all the available information and make that decision for yourself. But I think $250 for me personally, I would like to save that and get the 1700 XTX, which delivers the same sort of raster performance. And FSR and stuff's coming along, so there are DLSS 4 is looking pretty good, the upscaling there. But basically, all the things that Radeon doesn't do as well, I think at that discount, I would be like, oh, look, I'm going to go save the money. I feel like, saving, because let's be clear here, that would be coming in at that's actually at $750. That's a 19% saving. So, I mean, I see what you're saying. It really needs to be $700, doesn't it?
Well, I guess my thinking, right, is that $750 right now, as in not even factoring the 5070 Ti, which hasn't launched, right?
Yeah.
The nearest competitors are 4070 Ti Super. And how much faster is a 7900 XTX for rasterization?
Than a 4070 Super, did you say?
Yeah, 4070 Ti Super. So it's 20% faster? A 7900 XTX? Somewhere around there?
Yeah, it's actually bang on 20%.
So it's 20% faster. And yet a 4070 Ti is probably, actually I've got your numbers right here. It is at 4K ray tracing 40% faster. For 1440p ray tracing, it is
What was the average
It's
frame rate?
40% faster. Yeah, it's 40% faster. So
what
at
sorry,
14,
just to interrupt you though, the 4070 Ti Super, what was the average frame rate at 1440p?
80 FPS.
Okay, so it's very usable as well.
Yeah, so it's very usable. It's actually probably a little bit more than 40% faster because I calculated the 4070 Ti accidentally. So would a typical gamer be willing to buy a card at the same price that's 20% better at raster, but the alternate card is 40+% better at ray tracing? I think it's probably not cheap enough. I think at that level of gap between the two things, it probably needs to be even cheaper than $750. And
see,
as you point out, it's like 20% cost per frame difference. I don't know. Are people still listening to this podcast at this point as we ramble on about prices? Maybe.
Doesn't matter. We're just talking now. As we said, the podcast is really about conversations you and I have on the phone. And this is absolutely a conversation we would have on the phone. So we're just having it now. And I really like it. This is the problem, okay? AMD fans who are listening to this will be like, these guys are Nvidia shills. It doesn't need to be that much cheaper. That's absurd. It's competitive at that price. The shill nonsense and all that, ignoring that, I hear you. It is competitive at that price. $750 for a 1700 XTX is really highly competitive and a very compelling product depending on your use case. But as a general recommendation, the point that Tim's very clearly and accurately making is it's not a slam dunk for AMD. And it's not enough for AMD to be competitive because at what appears to be
competitive.
Yeah, what appears to be competitive to you, dear AMD fan, is not at all competitive. They need to be smashing it out of the park.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, they're not competing. So, as Tim's pointing out and sort of alluding to, $700 is really how much they can charge. So it's going to be $300 cheaper than the unimpressive, unimpressive RTX 5080 at the MSRPs. Mm-hmm. So whatever that ends up being.
I mean, yeah, my opinion is that if AMD makes an identical product, so they made it, like I said, a 5080, it's identical at everything, ray tracing, raster, features. You can probably ignore some features that maybe like AI stuff that gamers probably won't do, right? But most of the gaming focused stuff that people care about, it has to be identical. It still needs to be a decent amount cheaper for it to be a compelling purchase. Like, I don't think that if AMD made a RTX 5080 identical and priced at $900, that people would be flying out to buy the Radeon product.
We already have the answer. We like, hang on, let me bring this up. But we already have our answer because we have the day one review for that part, right? So upon release, according to our MSRP data across all the games we tested, compared to the 4080, it was 20% better value. So there you have it. There's the history for you. Out of the gate, AMD were offering for rasterization performance 20% better value than Nvidia. And the 4080 sucked and they kind of had to bring in, and didn't sell well. So Nvidia had to bring in the much more compelling 4080 Super, which was the same product with a price cut. So they didn't want to like officially price cut the 40 series and devalue it. So they just released a new product and was like, hey, this just happens to also be cheaper. That's weird. There's really no argument to be had there, is there? So
yeah, they priced it 20% cheaper and it didn't sell that well. I think it sold well for a couple of weeks around the launch. And then after that, not much interest.
Yeah, well, what I've heard from retailers and distributors is that the Radeon sales have been abysmal. So they've got to do something differently. If you're losing major partners because you're uncompetitive at 20% better value for raster, then it's probably more like what I said in the review, and it really does need to be about 25% better value to start probably moving stock at a reasonable rate.
Yeah, I think that obviously one of the issues that AMD has as well is the significant gap between raster and ray tracing performance. Like, all those discussions would be very, very different if the gap wasn't so large, because then you wouldn't have to be like, well, it's this amount faster for this, but this amount slower for ray tracing. So if they can significantly improve that, then they're immediately in a better position, and those sort of discussions around performance will start to make a little more sense, where you can just sort of talk more about the overall performance of products. But yeah, I mean, like I said, I think that if they made the exact same product, they still have to price it at quite a significant discount to get people interested. And that's the challenge that they're facing. And they've attempted it with other products as well, like the RX 7600 versus the RTX 4060. They're both about the same performance. The 4060 is what, $30 more expensive, and it sold way better. Way better. It flew off shelves relative to the 7600. So again, what's that? The price difference is not that much. It's like 10-20% better, somewhere in that range, off the top of
Mhm.
my head without calculating it.
Mhm.
And yeah, that didn't work either. Like a 10% discount clearly doesn't work. So
Yep.
hopefully they've learnt that lesson.
Yeah, exactly.
So anyway, do you have anything more to say about GPUs? Otherwise, we'll probably just end this podcast episode. We already talked about some boring life stuff earlier, unless you had anything, any quick updates.
No, not really. I was going to sort of vent and talk about the frustrations that we've had with Balon's car, but we can probably
Okay,
save that for the next podcast if you want.
sure.
Um,
Make a note, save it for the next
yeah,
podcast, and
yeah, we'll save it.
yeah,
It's not pressing or important information or anything like that. It was just a
yeah,
story, like my last story. Because yeah, my
cool.
boring life has just been testing. I'm very tired right now. And we've got another video going out at 1 a.m. tonight. So
Yep.
make sure that's all ready to go out. But yeah, it's been pretty hectic. And of course, we had the Z890 roundup that we finally finished, and return on investment's looking great on that one as expected. But
Well, it outperformed both of our
it
expectations in
did.
terms of views.
It
So we'll
did.
take that as a win.
Yeah, it did heavily outperform expectations. So that's good. And a lot of people's, seem appreciative of that. And we've got a B850 version in the works, but of course, this sort of testing does take a tremendous amount of time. So it's going to be, I know people are going to be asking me constantly, when's the B850 version coming? And it is coming, but could be a couple of months away at this point in time, because as I said, it takes at least a full day to test a motherboard, and I'm going to have around 50 again there. But maybe I'll do like a budget roundup first. Anyway.
All right. I guess that pretty much does it for another long Hardware Unboxed podcast episode, but it's release season, so you know what? We're going to be talking about a whole bunch of different things and all of the, I guess, just shower thoughts. There was a lot of shower thoughts sort of things in this episode of just us spitballing about various different scenarios and things like that, which again, we discuss a lot of this offline, so making it part of the podcast is hopefully been enjoyable for people. So yeah, thanks to everyone that's listened all the way to the end. And yeah, video version's available, audio version, the usual places you can get that sort of thing. We also have the ad-free podcast feed. If you're a Patreon member, that's up and running now. So if you don't like ads for whatever reason, you just want an audio version, it's there for you. And yeah, that'll pretty much do it for this one. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.